So today we're going to discuss one of the first section of assignment 3 we'll be doing about, and I've titled it Mexican Immigration, Development, and the Deportation of 1.8 million Mexicans. I don't see where you all are. Oh, I'm not sharing the screen. There we go. Now you all see the screen, right? Do you all see the screen, Monique? Yep, okay. One of the really, he's one of my favorite American writers, California-based writers. He's out of near Monterey, California. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath in the 1930s. So I'm assigning you an excerpt from his Grapes of Wrath called The Harvest Gypsies. And I think he does it in a very eloquent, very Steinbeckian way. He captures the migration issues of the 1930s between the rivalries between ethnic Greek folks, Filipino folks, Mexican folks, and how growers played them off each other and what we should do to move forward. So I look forward to hearing your comments about this great American writer. Y'all heard of John Steinbeck before? I'm just curious. We're all made to read his stuff earlier in life? Yeah, Monique, what do you read? Probably not The Grapes of Wrath, probably Of Mice and Men.
I ended up reading that excerpt, or at least an excerpt from him in one of your previous classes. And then I also think I read, I think it's called The Red Pony or something like that.
Yep, that's one of his. Yep, The Pearl, The Red Pony. Oh, good. You're right. I assigned him in my US history class as well, just because he's, I don't know, he's a great writer and I like his approach. To cite my source, remember, don't believe me, this ain't Sunday and I'm not a preacher. Here's one of my main sources for today's lecture. This book called Decade of Betrayal, Mexican Repatriation in the 1930s, put out by University of New Mexico Press in 2006. Okay. All right, let us begin. Oh, so good to see your faces. So this is a graph just capturing how many Mexicans entered the United States officially, according how many Mexicans actually came through the Ellis Island of the South, which was in El Paso, Texas. So the numbers are probably a lot higher, those who didn't register with immigration services. Nevertheless, it gives you an idea about the level of Mexicans coming into the country. Too bad we don't have numbers of the number of Mexicans leaving the country, because many of these migrants coming into the United States would migrate during the harvest season and then return to Mexico after making some money. But you'll also see, why did immigration just shut off in the 1930s? What was going on in the 1930s that just did not make the United States an appealing place to go? Yeah, Lee, I read your lips. The Depression, right? The great worldwide economic capitalist collapse. So when I called it the Ellis Island of the South, I'm really talking about this immigration station in El Paso, Texas, which saw the entrance of many, many Mexicans, mostly Mexicans, some other Central American migrants, but mostly Mexicans. And the numbers jumped from 200,000 entering the country in 1910 to in 1930, 600,000. So just an exponential jump in the number of Mexicans coming in. And why were Mexicans leaving Mexico? What was going on in Mexico that pushed Mexicans out in the early 1900s? Do y'all know? Lee, you and I talked about it last time.
Yeah, the revolution and all the conflicts related to that.
Yeah, and again, it was the Mexican Revolution, which it's the first 20 years of the 20th century, basically. I don't want to put exact numbers on it. So the Mexican Revolution was a very violent internal conflict between various groups, and it left 1 million dead, and 1 million left Mexico as refugees. Most of them, but not all of them, into the United States. Some of them went to Cuba and other places. So when you think about migration, anytime when you think about Syrian migration out of Syria or Congolese migration out of the Congo, you have to think of what factors are forcing people out and where are they going? What are the things that are pulling people to places? And as we discussed last time with Tomochik, the pull to the US was work, right? The Southwest was developing agriculturally, railroads were being built, copper mining, silver mining, uranium mining was booming. So they were coming up for work, right, in order to put food on the table. Woof. And here are Mexicans being inspected at the border. Quote for what the Border Patrol called gardening jobs, farm and manual labor. What strikes you about this image, though? Let me pick on you. What strikes you about this border inspection image? Yadira, Justin, Emma, Lee, or Monique?
Well, obviously they're all naked, and it's obviously kind of going to be a little dehumanizing, you know, having you all stacked up and kind of put like cattle basically to be inspected.
Yeah, it's very dehumanizing, completely. And I have found no evidence, and if you all find evidence, let me know, of this process of lining out naked migrants all together in a room and inspecting them. I don't see where that ever happened with Ellis Island immigrants from Europe. Please let me know, but I've looked and I cannot find it. So it's a very specific racist way to dehumanize migrants coming from the southern border. And what did these migrants do when they came up? Well, they helped the Southwest develop, right? It wasn't only Mexican, but there were Filipino, there were Chinese, there were European migrants who helped build railroads. Okay, helped lay irrigation pipe. I know this is a funny image, a fuzzy image, but this is an image of Ventura County, California, down south in 1920, and Mexican-American workers laying irrigation pipe. What's another element that led to the boom in migration and development? Well, it was the federal policies. After the last of the Northern California natives and the Southern Oregon natives were conquered, you all just got done reading the first 2 chapters of Benjamin Madley's book, right? About California genocide. Wasn't that powerful? Right? So what did the federal government do after these lands were acquired from Native Americans? Acquired is probably the wrong action verb. The federal government invested money in developing these lands all across the West, not just in the image I'm showing you here. This is the Klamath River watershed. All right, the water starts way up here near the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon and exits way over here in Requa at the mouth of the Klamath River. And what this Reclamation Act did was to invest in a series of dams. So you dam up all these watersheds, and then it's perfect for farm labor. And this is what brought many, you might wonder why, geez, why are there so many Mexican Americans on the California-Oregon border? Well, many of them came in the early 1900s to work these farms, right in here. And here's Redding, the big red X is Redding, California. The result of this is that in the early 1900s, the United States became the #1 producer of agriculture exports in the world, right? And it was based on Mexican, Filipino, and other migrant labor workers, especially here in the West. Migrant laborers offered growers cheap and plentiful labor. For example, those farmers of you out here, what crop is ready earliest in the year, right? In early spring, what crop do you go harvest early? Can you guess? What's an early year crop? Monique, you're not a farmer? No. So things like lettuce, right? Lettuce is an early year crop. So what farmers would do is go down to the Imperial Valley and places in Southern California, harvest lettuce, and move north when the second biggest thing to harvest is cherries. And then later on in the harvest season, it's apricots and almonds, for example. So these migratory laborers lived in these temporary housing units, right? Really just really lack conditions, very, very sketchy conditions, because the farm growers didn't invest money in, much less schooling, in housing and much less schooling. And again, this was a job that families would do. This is an issue we'll be dealing with later when we talk about 20th century migration of especially Mexican-American farm workers. Is oftentimes kids would be pulled out of their local schools because the family had to move here to go harvest crops down south in the Imperial Valley. And then a month later, they'd have to go up to Kern County to harvest pomegranates or something. So this they moved a lot, and it cost a lot of young Mexican-Americans the opportunity to, have a home and go to school. And going to school is the thing we'll focus on in future lectures. Here's an example of a temporary home in farm workers, again, down in the Imperial Valley. And the reason I mentioned Dorothea Lange, she is a federal government, during the Great Depression, the federal government paid a lot of folks to do work. That's what the United States government did to get out of the Great Depression. And Dorothea Lange is one of the photographers to capture everyday life for Americans. And here's a photo of some temporary homes in the Imperial Valley. And I think this Texas cotton planter was one of many agricultural owners who had this philosophy. Many agricultural owners would go to Mexico, not themselves, but send buses down to Mexico, get a bunch of workers, bring them up, have them harvest their cotton or whatever that's going on, and then ship them back to Mexico when they're done. For example, one California orchard owner, this is one's picking oranges. It doesn't look like it, but those are oranges. He said, "When they have finished harvesting my crops, I will kick them out on the country road. My obligation is ended." So many in the United States knew that they faced this conundrum that they needed, right? The economy needed migrant labor in order to survive. California is dependent upon migrant labor to this day in order to survive. But many in the United States didn't want, say, Mexican neighborhoods to pop up near them because of straight-old racism. And this slide is basically a reason to show off this powerful picture. Look at, these are construction guys. See the big old saw, look at his, oh, he's a telephone line worker, this guy right here. What to do with Mexican Americans in the US? And if I could, I'm going to stop share because I'm sick and tired and I want to watch you, look at your faces. What do you think were some of the options for Americans? What could we do with Mexican Americans in the United States? And throw any old ideas out there.
Fortunately, there was a mass deportation at the beginning of the Great Depression.
Yep, we can deport them, which we are going to do at the end of this lecture. Unfortunately, you're right. Justin or Emma, can I pick on you? I can't see you, but I see your wonderful names. What else could we do with Mexican Americans?
Accept them.
We could, oh my gosh, love thy neighbor. We could love thy neighbor, right? Yay, thank you, groovy Emma. Justin, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, you could kind of relegate them, I guess, to extremely dangerous and high labor jobs that you don't really want to do.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happened, right? Jobs that many Americans, and still Americans today, who don't want to do. There's so many cultural fields throughout the United States that their produce is not being harvested today because the lack of migrant labor from Mexico, still today. Monique, what might be another option? Embrace, deport, give them cruddy jobs and pay them little?
Honestly, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good, I like those answers. I don't know. And Yadira has her handful. Oh my gosh, see, all you workers and moms out there, you rock. It's okay, no worries. Well, as we saw as you all are finishing up assignment 2 or already turned it in, we could run them out and kill them like the Texas Rangers did with Mexican Americans. We can deport them like Lee suggested. We can turn them into Americans, which I'll talk about in a second, Americanize them. By the way, newsflash, migrants always Americanize themselves, right? There's always folks who learn English and become Americans. Or Emma brought up the revolutionary idea, we can just embrace them. like these teachers did here. This is from Chicago, Illinois. In 1927, this is a children's folkloric group celebrating Cinco de Mayo. And in my next lecture, which I'm going to record all by my lonesome, I'm going to talk about different responses that Mexican Americans had to all these anti-Mexican American sentiments and policies in the United States. One of the responses they had was to celebrate their culture, like Cinco de Mayo and other things. As you all are listening to that podcast from the end of assignment 2, there was massive number of lynchings of Mexican Americans. And lynching just means being killed by a mob without due process. It doesn't necessarily mean being hung from a tree. It's just mob rule killing. So there was at least 600 Mexican Americans lynched in the Southwest. Those are the ones we know about and that are documented. As the old Texas Ranger saying goes, if a Tejano wouldn't sell his land, his widow would. In other words, as Anglo-Americans were encroached on Spanish-speaking Tejano lands, one of the ways in which to get that land was to kill the landowner. And as I set this up, there's not only a sentiment against Mexican Americans growing in the United States in the early 1900s, there was a sentiment among certain elements in the United States of being worried about all these other immigrants coming from Italy or Eastern Europe, being Catholic or Jewish or having darker skin. So this is an image here that I'm sure Monique has seen before, and those of you who've taken Emma have seen this before in my other classes. Here's Uncle Sam worried about the dangers to American ideas and institutions as all these migrants who don't look like Uncle Sam or quote unquote the riffraff are swarming to America. So various politicians and other Americans were arguing about we need to restrict immigration. You all are going to be reading a couple paragraphs from Congressman John Box that basically laid out this sentiment, we serve whites only, no Mexicans or Spanish. So whereas in the US South, there was anti-Black discrimination, in the Southwest, there was a hardcore anti-Mexican or Spanish Latino discrimination. Where was this coming from? And again, stop me anytime, Monique, Lee, Emma, Justin, and Yadira, because I get tired of hearing myself talk. Where was this coming from? Well, parallel to this, there was an increase in what historians have come to call nativism. And it was this idea that we want America for Americans. And they don't mean Native Americans. They literally mean white Protestant Americans. That's who they are defining as American. And they were against Jews, Catholics, Blacks, Greeks, Italians oftentimes, and of course, Mexicans. And the most prominent manifestation of this, right, it had many different manifestations, from redlining who could live in what neighborhoods, right, who banks would loan money to keep neighborhoods segregated, to groups like the KKK. And in the 1910s and 20s, the KKK had a huge upsurge again. And it was a mainstream organization. There was marches down Washington, D.C., and these dudes are not even covering their face, right? They don't care because it's mainstream. In my US history class, we go into this more in depth. And it was, as I said, a mainstream organization. You could write for free information. You can buy stock. The KKK was an organization that had stock in the stock market. The Invisible Empire, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. So what impact did this have on Mexican Americans in the Southwest? How did it impact immigration? Well, many of LA's oldest restaurants, for example, and remember, LA, Los Angeles, was founded by, right, New Spain and Mexican migrants. So some of the oldest restaurants in Los Angeles changed their name. For example, there's a number of different examples of, instead of Mexican food, now you went and had Spanish food. So at least Spanish was seen as less dangerous than Mexican. In 1924, another major policy shift in immigration happened. right? Congress passed this, the president signed it, and it became federal law. And we didn't see another policy shift in immigration until 1965. So this Immigration Act of 1924, its mission statement was, quote, to preserve the idea of American homogeneity. And what do I mean by that? What's that fancy word mean, homogeneity? To preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. Go ahead, Lee. You were muted.
All the same.
Yeah, so the
Same
idea,
genes.
go ahead.
I was going to say the same genes, probably, the same genetics.
Yeah, actually, there's no genetic difference between ethnic peoples or races. A race is a totally made-up thing. So we're
I
not.
know, but I mean, like, I think it sounds like in their mind, though, that's what they'd be talking about. Because homo means same, and
Yeah, exactly.
geneticity would probably mean genetics. So, I mean, as far as they're concerned, they believe that there's a genetic difference. It would
Oh,
sound
dude, right on. I love etymology. I love tearing apart words and finding out their Latin and Greek origins or whatever. Exactly, Justin. They wanted everybody with the same genes. So this is what they were thinking. You're exactly right. My bad, Justin. However, nowhere in the Immigration Act of 1924 were Mexicans named. Why not? Why no Mexican quota in the Immigration Act? Ooh, here's your $50,000 question. Okay, 2 peso question. Why no Mexicans in the act? Monique, Emma, Lee, Justin, or Yadira? Oh, you're busy, Yadira.
I guess it'd be because I felt like they had too many already.
Good guess. Great, great guess. So check this out. At the same time the Immigration Act was passed, the Border Patrol was created. Here we go. This is our first of many discussions about the Border Patrol. Its latest manifestation is ICE. So the Border Patrol was created not on the Canadian border, but on the Mexican-US border to control Mexican migrants like a faucet. This is its mission statement. It said like a faucet. In other words, when the economy in the US was booming and we needed migrant labor to build railroads or pick walnuts, the Border Patrol just welcomed migrants in, right? On the other hand, when the economy had a downturn and Americans blamed people like Mexicans for the economic downturn, falsely, I might add, they could shut off the border, thereby politically saying, look, we're doing something about economic improvement by keeping Mexicans out. So you cannot think of this 1924 Immigration Act without thinking about, wait a minute, why aren't Mexicans there? It's in order to control their migratory status. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Another major policy that impacted Mexican-American workers all the way through the farm workers movement and even Mexican-American workers today, and not only them, but many other workers today, is in 1935 in response to the rising demand for unionization amongst American private sector workers, like United Auto Workers, coal miners, et cetera. The US government guaranteed the right for people working in private companies to unionize. However, except domestics and farm workers. So if you were a nanny or a servant or a butler, you did not have the right to unionize. If you're a farm worker, you did not have the right to unionize. Why do you think they were not given the right to unionize? Lee, Monique, Emma, Justin? Because
they largely weren't white.
Exactly, they weren't a white voting bloc. Exactly. So, quote unquote, domestic and farm workers were mostly ethnic minorities. So for example, African-American farm laborers in the South, or butlers in the South, or women, right? Exactly. That doesn't mean that many Mexican-American, many other workers didn't try to unionize, right? There was an attempt to unionize domestic help, right? Domestic workers and butlers. There was attempts to unionize Black Pullman car workers, attempts by farm workers to unionize. If you'll remember, Emma last time called Teresa Urrea really cool. And one of the things I found really cool about her, this was the last lecture, is that she went to LA at the later years of her life and worked the rest of her life trying to help farm workers unionize and get better conditions. So the 1930s saw bad times all around. Here's a little musical interlude. And too bad I sing really poorly and play guitar even worse. But here's a Mexican corrido, Mexican-American corrido, capturing the sadness of the time. And it's much better in its original Spanish, but let me just give you the English version of it. And I've yet to find this, a recording of this, so let me just say it. So remember, a Mexican corrido is just a story about life, kind of like we have the blues, right? In these unhappy times, depression still pursues us. Lots of prickly pears is eaten for lack of other food. No light is seen in the house, nor does water flow from the tap. The people are in tatters and in a deplorable state, right? So it's just capturing the depth of, right, the conditions of the 1930s. So one of the things Americans contemplated to do with Mexican Americans that y'all didn't mention, which is totally fine, I wouldn't have guessed it easy either, is to let's try to turn Mexicans into Americans. How do you do that? Well, this is a publication that was written by a San Bernardino County school teacher, and it was called Americanization Through Homemaking. So let's teach, and this is geared towards Mexican women, young women. Let's teach American women how to sew, course of study, millinery, gardening, all these different things. Do you think Mexican American women knew how to sew? I think so too. It's the same, right? So there was these classes to teach Mexican American girls sewing, cooking, cleaning, and I'm sure these classes weren't teaching them how to make tortillas, right? Or mole, like Justin asked about last week, right? It was to make quote unquote American food, right? Why do you think there was classes to teach Mexican American these jobs, sewing, cooking, cleaning? What would be the end result or the outcome of these classes? Where could you go get a job?
Domestic labor.
Boom, you got your maids, right? Your muchacha, as they call it in a very derogatory term in Mexico. That was the goal. If we assimilate the countless number of Mexicans that cross our southern border, we must begin at the basic structure of their social order, the home. And the idea was if we assimilate Mexican American girls and young women, they will in turn assimilate the young boys and the men. So that's another thing another policy Americans were playing around with at the time, which is on one hand better than frickin' what the Texas Rangers were doing, but on the other hand, right, a school for creating domestic help. They weren't trying to teach those young women how to be lawyers, right, or philosophy professors. No, it was things like this. Okay, we got about 7 more minutes. So another major shift, and to get
One
back.
question real quick, sorry.
Yes.
I mean, do you think that was just simply like a race thing, or do you think that was also primarily like a gender thing? Because I mean, at the time, it's not like they were trying to teach white women or, you know, the upper class white women how to be lawyers or doctors either at that time. I mean, it was kind of like that was the female job in general, or jobs, right?
No, you're exactly right, and thank you so much for that clarification. Actually, at this time in the early 1900s, many wealthy white American women were attending university at the time, right? A lot. But you're right, for the average, like lower class or poor white woman, this would be one of their go-to jobs. You're exactly right about that, Justin. I forgot to put in that, that comparison.
I mean, even the wealthy women who attended school, though, even back then, a lot of that was just for them to meet their husbands, right? I mean, they still weren't really looking to make them lawyers and doctors very often, or nurses. They could be nurses or they could be teachers, but they couldn't be doctors and lawyers, right?
Yeah, great points. The joke during World War II, during the GI Bill, is that women went to college to get their MRS, right? To become a Mrs., like you said, to find her husband. But no, there was an uptick in wealthy women going to school in the early 1900s. You're exactly right, but I take your caveat, Justin, and thank you for that. Thank you for making it more, it's always more interesting when you all chime in. So just please chime in.
I'd say that at the same time, even though it was targeted specifically towards women, it was also targeted towards Mexican people in general, considering that they were expecting, by assimilating these women, for them to assimilate the men in turn.
No, you're
I
exactly
know
right.
it,
And
Like,
it
I don't
definitely
really
was
think you can
targeted.
disconnect race from this at all.
No, I'm not. No, well, I mean, what I mean, you can disconnect a little bit of race from it, meaning that, like, it wasn't just men, or it wasn't just the fact that they were Hispanic that they were trying teaching the women the domestic jobs. It was because that's what they felt women had to do in general too. And they were definitely targeting, Hispanics. The whole point was to assimilate them. I'm not trying to argue that point at all. But just the fact that the jobs they chose for them probably weren't simply just due to the race. It was also just them trying to turn them into Americans, like they said. And a good white American wife would also do all of these things. So it wasn't just racist, I'm guessing I'm trying to get across. It was also misogynist in a way as well. I'm just saying it was both, you know what I mean?
Monique's nodding her head. She's giving you the slow, heavy metal nod. Yeah.
I mean, the whole point of them hiring a domestic help in the first place is so wealthy white women didn't have to do labor like this.
Yeah.
No, that's true. But if
Like,
you were just a typical white
let's not
person,
get
though,
them
you
off
would
the
do it.
hook.
It's not taking someone off the hook. It's just putting it in perspective that it wasn't just simply a racist thing. It was also a gender thing. I mean, it's not fair to also just put the one light onto it and to try and say that it was simply racist when it was racist and misogynist. I mean, you might as well go ahead and give it the full credit it deserves. That's what I'm trying to do.
I think like in history, there's multiple truths, and I love your two truths. One thing to add to Justin's point, for example, on the East Coast, those women who were fresh off the boat from Italy, right, or Russian Jews, or Ireland, they're the ones who largely had the domestic labor jobs, okay? So it's like the first generation refugees to come in. In the Southwest, it just happened to be Mexican Americans. So Justin, you are, I hear you, and thank you for making this conversation better. And Lee, you're right. Don't let them off. We're not letting anybody off the hook. I like how Justin said it was racist and misogynistic.
I agree. I agree with that. I just don't want to take the wealthy white women who largely exploited other women's labor.
Yep. And their families. Let's not just
Yeah.
big white women, right? The whole family structure. Yep.
I'm trying to point out white women are getting screwed both ways in any ways. Not the wealthy people in general always kind of exploit, people, but even the white wealthy women were getting exploited at the time too. There's plenty of exploitation to go around.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great conversation. And interesting, yeah, Dita, Monique, and Emma, the three women in this group, are not chiming in because they're busy multitasking, doing all these other things, huh? Well, we're mansplaining to you, huh? No, I'm just teasing.
Doing the labor. Yeah, they're doing all the labor, domestic labor.
Okay. Ready to go? Should we roll? Okay. So another key data point that's going to shift history, right? That's what historians do, look at change over time. The Dust Bowl and the Great Depression in the United States brought 1 million Eastern Americans west to work in the fields as migrant workers, right? We call them variously Okies or Arkies. Redding's own Merle Haggard, his family moved to Bakersfield, California. He ended up moving up here to Palo Cedro, right? And Merle Haggard is one of the best poets of the 20th century, capturing everyday life of, hardworking Californians. He's just an example of one of these migrants to come. So whose jobs are they going to want and whose jobs are they going to take? Well, largely migrant laborers, whether they're Filipino, Japanese, or Mexican-American migrant laborers in the United States. So in the 1930s, after 1 million migrants came to California looking for jobs, the migrant labor force in California and elsewhere was no longer needed. And politically, many started to blame Mexicans, Filipinos, and Japanese for taking these quote unquote American jobs. So what was the result of this? Under the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and with the okay of the Congress, there were 1.8 million Mexicans deported in the 1930s. And this is something that we should teach far more often and yell it from the rooftops in our history classes. Mind you, 60% of the Mexican Americans deported were citizens, right? So nobody was checking carefully about who these folks were. 80% of those deported from California were legal residents, right? So maybe they weren't, so they were either citizens or had working papers, right? Our version of the green card to work in the States. This is something that needs to be brought to light. So Lee, I know you heard about this because you mentioned this earlier. Has any of you others heard about the 1930s deportation of over 1 million Mexicans? Yeah, Dita, Justin, Emmer, Monique, I'm just curious.
I've never heard of it. It's kind of crazy actually that
It
something like
is.
that happened. I mean, I guess Roosevelt, they try to kind of have glossy eyes on him because of,
I know.
World War II and
He's a
all.
saint. You're right. You're
They
right.
overlook his redlining practice.
Yeah, there was red lighting practices happening, and I'll talk about that in a future thing. So Monique, Emmer, Yadira haven't heard of this massive deportation?
I've heard of it. Actually, I learned about it in
What?
one of your classes.
Oh, okay. See, I do scream it from the rooftops. I'll teach a history of Japan, and I got to throw this in there. So 1.8 million Mexican, quote unquote, Mexicans were deported. Remember, most of them were citizens. But the younger generation of, like the second generation of migrants who either came here very young or had grown up in the United States, didn't want to go back to Mexico. Mexico was like a foreign country to them. They knew about Kern County. They knew about Fresno or wherever, Tehama. And she says, this mother saying, sometimes I tell my children that I would like to go to Mexico, but they tell me we don't want to go. We belong here, right? This is where I grew up. This is where my friends are. So it's still a conundrum for many folks today. We'll talk about that later. So next time, we will look at what did various Mexican American and their allies, what did they do in response to this anti-Mexican American policy and prejudice? Well, one of the many things folks did was organize. This is a group of lawyers, right? Kind of middle-class, educated, assimilated group of lawyers who formed the League of United Latin American Citizens called LULAC. LULAC is still around today. It's kind of like the ACLU, but they focus on issues for Latinos and Latinas. It was founded in 1929, right at the same time as anti-immigrant hysteria was at its max. And one of LULAC's first jobs, we'll see a lot of LULAC in the rest of the class, was to get Mexican Americans, whether they were a citizen, whether they had a green card, or whether they didn't, to be counted in the census. Just like this year, folks are trying to get everybody counted in the census, right? The census is mandated to count everybody, not folks who have papeles or have a green card. It's everybody. So federal monies can be allocated for highways and schools and everything else. So interestingly, this is one of the first things that LULAC spearheaded to get everybody counted in the census. Yeah, interesting. Okay. Any questions or what struck you about this?
I had a question. We were talking about the young Mexican American women that were kind of like learning more Americanized practices and everything. I was wondering if that was kind of connected to the eugenics movement that was going on at that time and trying to either eliminate certain races and that kind of thing, hoping they would find white husbands. Was that connected with that, or is that sort of like a different movement and motivation?
That's a great question. The eugenics movement in the United States and in Western Europe attempted to quote unquote breed only the best. So a lot of people of color, poor people, or people who were deemed as imbeciles. There's a book called Imbecile. That was the verbiage they used at the time. Would literally sterilize women and men, right? So they could not have kids. You know what? I don't know. I need to do my homework about that, Emma. I know a lot about how African Americans or folks in quote unquote mental institutions were sterilized. They go into the hospital, get sterilized, didn't even know it because they were knocked out and put back into society. But what I do know, a number of migrants, you know, those concentration camps we have on the border right now that are holding thousands of migrants and refugees, many, many women are being sterilized right now in those detention centers against their will, totally
Yeah.
against their will.
Right, I read about that.
Yeah, isn't that just freaking horrific?
Yeah.